Final Fantasy IX is an absolutely beloved game, and it is my personal favorite in the mainline series, except 7 Remake. Does that count as a mainline game? Anyway, in this video, I want to talk about the remake of this game in not 7. No, you're not going to be in the spotlight this time. Well, boo-hoo. Other Final Fantasy games deserve a chance sometimes too, you know? Sheesh. I mean, we all know it's coming at some point, right? If you were even recommended this video, let alone clicked on it, you believe the rumors about the remake are true. I know who you are. But the question is, how should Square Enix actually go about remaking Final Fantasy IX? Should they even bother remaking it? And what would make it worth remaking? Let's start with answering why remaking Final Fantasy IX would be a good idea. First off, money. Obviously. I mean, the fanbase clearly begs Square Enix at every opportunity to remake whatever their favorite Final Fantasy game is. All you have to do is look at any one of their social media pages and see all the comments. They will literally make posts about non-Final Fantasy stuff that they do, like Power Wash Simulator or Pride Month or whatever, and there will always be comments ranging from polite asks to being verbally abusive, demanding that they remake insert their favorite Final Fantasy game, even though it has absolutely nothing to do with the post that they made, but they just can't help themselves, can they? So clearly, there are people ready to open up their wallets for just about any Final Fantasy remake, including Final Fantasy IX. So why do all these people want remakes of these old games so badly? Well, two really basic answers to these questions. 1, nostalgia. 2, technology improvements. And really, they go together. You see, back in the days when Final Fantasy IX released, every new console released improved by leaps and bounds. The graphics, the sound quality, the disk storage capacity, and more improved by such a wide margin that it often made you wonder what some of your favorite games on previous consoles would look like if they were made on a new console. Like, for instance, when Final Fantasy X came out for the PS2, even though the camera perspective was fixed, it still featured fully rendered 3D environments in many cases. This also allowed the developers to do more with the camera, especially during cutscenes, which enabled them to express more emotion with close-ups of characters' facial expressions. And on top of that, they added voice acting for the first time.
Next, try laughing out loud.
When I was growing up and played Final Fantasy X for the first time, I immediately wondered what it would be like to play the previous Final Fantasy games, but on the PS2 hardware with voice acting and close-ups of their faces during cutscenes. You know you want to see Queena's tongue up close? And at this point, the PS2 hardware is pretty old now, to say the least, and if many wanted to see a game like Final Fantasy IX remade at that time, then it's only natural people would definitely want a remake of it now, as the hardware has improved more than tenfold since then. So it's clear that there is a demand for Final Fantasy IX Remake, and it would certainly be easy for Square Enix to profit off of it, but is it actually necessary? Would it even be worth it? To be honest, I'm not sure that doing a full remake of Final Fantasy IX is really all that necessary, especially if you've played the Maguri mod of the PC version, which does an excellent job at updating the visuals to 4K resolution, among other perks. Final Fantasy IX is already a masterpiece as it is, and this is proven by many a YouTube video of highlights from people's streams playing the game for the first time. Just go on YouTube and search "my first time playing Final Fantasy IX," and you'll get a bunch of results of people who have shared their experience playing the game for the first time. And most of them are just as overwrought with emotion experiencing the story as I did when I was a kid. This proves, to me at least, that this game is timeless despite being a 23-year-old game. Even the pre-rendered CG cutscenes hold up extraordinarily well, even though in-engine graphics these days easily surpass the graphical fidelity of these scenes. But they're just so incredibly shot and directed that just because we have better hardware and graphics does not necessarily mean that these will be better produced if remade. Art direction matters, which we're gonna get to in just a moment. But it begs the question that if it's not necessary, would I even buy a remake if it came out? Or even care that it was remade? Well, the short answer is, well, yeah, I'm gonna be a sucker and buy it out of curiosity if nothing else, given it's like one of my favorite games of all time. You will too. Don't lie to me, bitch. The better question is, what would make it worth playing? So, getting back to art direction, what kind of aesthetic would make a Final Fantasy IX remake worth it? A few people would say that it should look more realistic with realistic proportions. So, you mean like this? Or like this? For the record, those art pieces were actually meant to be less realistic and more dark, as the artist literally claimed they were a Dark Souls take on the characters. But even still, I don't think that making them more realistic is the right way to go. So a lot of people also think that it should look like Dissidia. Now, don't get me wrong, the Dissidia games look gorgeous, especially those glimmering eyes in Dissidia NT, but I don't think that's quite right. The thing about Dissidia is it's meant to have a stylized look that can work for any Final Fantasy game, which is important considering the fact that many Final Fantasy games feature wildly different styles. And while I think Tetsuya Nomura's design of Zidane in Dissidia is pretty cool and is easily recognizable as the same character, he definitely added his own little touches that I'm not so sure would be fitting of a Final Fantasy IX remake. Like, what's with these metal leather band things in front of his gloves? Doesn't that defeat the purpose of gloves? Like, why not just wear a gauntlet? And with those boots, he been looking like he's zipping off to the lane between to search for Terra.
Wait, Ben!
Other people think that it should look like Project Memoria, which has a more cartoonish look. And it's certainly not a bad look for a remake, but that's still not quite right. Honestly, the way it should look is, well, simpler than you think. It should look like, dare I say, the original game. You see these CG cutscenes? It should look most similar to that, but maybe a bit brighter color palette. And with modern capabilities, they can easily add more details to textures, higher poly count on the models, better lighting, etc. The second component that is particularly important for the art direction is animation, and I think this is arguably more important than the visuals. Final Fantasy IX is sometimes compared to a Disney movie, and maybe that's not an accurate one-to-one analogy, but I don't think it's an unwarranted comparison. From Vivi's tripping to Steiner's clinkety-clanky armor and excessive jumping up and down, there is definitely a cartoonish element to Final Fantasy IX, but less like a Saturday morning cartoon and more like a Disney feature film, which is the reason for the Disney comparison, I guess. And while Project Memoria does have a cartoonish animation style and looks fantastic, and much of the graphics and animation appear to be very professionally made, it strikes me in more of the former category, being a Saturday morning cartoon kind of vibe, and I don't think it's exactly right for an official remake of Final Fantasy IX. Again, I'm not trying to knock Project Memoria or anyone who worked on it. Like, it's really cool actually, and it's somewhere in the ballpark of what I would expect from a Final Fantasy IX remake, but just not quite the right fit, I don't think. So, if I didn't already make it clear, yes, the remake should use handcrafted animations and not use motion capture. And honestly, Square Enix is a great company to handle this. I mean, have you played Kingdom Hearts 3? The animations in that game are spectacular, and the CG cutscenes in that game are so good they're near indistinguishable from Disney's animations themselves. I mean, did you know that the scene where Elsa sings Let It Go in the Frozen world was completely recreated by Square Enix from the ground up themselves? How many of you knew that? Let me know in the comments. They have some real talent over there, and if they're not being kept busy, they're gonna find work somewhere else. I think that involving some of their talent to work on a Final Fantasy IX remake would be absolutely perfect. Keep them busy, Square. Bringing them on board to help would definitely make it worth remaking. And to match the animations, it would of course be worth adding voice acting and fully animated cutscenes. I mean, this was the dream after Final Fantasy X came out, right? But naturally, this comes with a caveat. The voice acting has to actually be good. Now, we've heard some of the characters from Final Fantasy IX and various spin-off Final Fantasy games, and I'm going to focus on the English versions as I haven't heard the Japanese voices. In my opinion, the voices of Zidane and Kuja in Dissidia are acceptable, but not stellar.
They won't even see me coming. Come on, we can take these goons down.
What tortured screams shall grace our ears? Soon you shall know eternal pain.
I personally would prefer that they get recast for the remake, but I suppose I should be careful for what I wish for, because it's always possible they could turn out worse. Vivi we've seen in various games like Kingdom Hearts 2.
Huh? How did I get here?
World of Final Fantasy,
Hey! Who made all this smoke?
and Chocobo GP,
Please, sir, that's not what happened!
and in my opinion has never really been voice acted properly either, so yeah, he also should probably be recast. I don't think any of his voice performances really capture his shy and innocent attributes particularly well, which are really important aspects to nail given his tragic backstory. But the most important character to get right is Steiner in my opinion. He also happens to be my favorite character in Final Fantasy IX, by the way. He needs to have a loud and boisterous voice, exaggerating his very high and low emotional states with an urgently demanding inflection, which plays into his character, because it often makes him sound oblivious or ignorant, which is what is supposed to make him so funny. I feel like a lot of people that play Final Fantasy IX never really understand the writer's comedic intent with Steiner, but with the right voice performance, it could really change people's perspective on his character and might find themselves laughing hysterically at all of his silly moments. The only instance that we've heard a voice performance for Steiner is in Chocobo GP.
You've committed a crime. I apologize for the belated introduction. My name is Steiner. I command the Knights of Pluto of Alexandria. Something smells indeed. Only upon proving your innocence will I allow you to leave.
And I gotta say, this is not it. Now, I get that, the lines aren't really written in the same vein as the original game, and it's hard to convey all of his charm in the short scenes that he appears in Chocobo GP, so the voice actor probably doesn't really have a grasp on the character from just what's depicted of him in this game. But rest assured, if this is the performance we get in the remake, I'm gonna be very disappointed. So the track record so far for voiced Final Fantasy IX characters isn't looking so hot, if I'm being honest. And quite frankly, this is an important aspect to making this remake worth it. If they don't get the voice acting right, then I might as well just play the original game with the Moguri mod. But, of course, if the Japanese voice acting is done well, then hopefully it's included as an option to use for us English folk. Then it might be worth it. One of the reasons that remaking Final Fantasy VII was worth it... Yes, you can come back into the spotlight for a brief moment. One of the reasons that remaking Final Fantasy VII was worth it was because it wasn't just a straight-up remake. It was more than that. In fact, 3 games worthy, and as of this video, we've only seen the first part of it. We didn't just get to see the same game, but with better visuals and quality of life improvements, but it was a complete reimagining of the original game with more fleshed out characters and world. So, you might be thinking that since I love how Final Fantasy VII was remade into multiple parts, that I would want Final Fantasy IX to be remade in the same way. And actually, no. Okay, you're done now. Attention, whore. This is part of my hesitation regarding a remake of Final Fantasy IX in the first place, as I don't think it would necessarily benefit from this kind of remake treatment. You see, a lot of the games that Kitase/Creative Business Unit 1 worked on seemed to have more complex worlds and were generally just more ambitious in its ideas. And one of the problems with playing some of those games is that even after completing them, you're often left wondering how much more they could have been. It almost feels like they always wanted to make their games multiple parts, and it's somewhat revealing that as soon as Sakaguchi left, that's exactly what they did. Here's some of what Square Enix put out just so conveniently after Sakaguchi left. The Final Fantasy VII compilation games, a sequel to Final Fantasy X. They tried to create a series of games called the Fabula Nova Crystallis project, which completely fell apart, and instead they made not 1, but 2 sequels to Final Fantasy XIII, turning it into a trilogy. Hell, they even made Final Fantasy XII a sequel in an RTS game called Revenant Wings on the DS, as well as Final Fantasy IV in the after years. Before he left Square, there were no sequels and only a couple of ports of their games. In other words, it's pretty clear that Sakaguchi was never a fan of sequels, or remakes, or even ports for that matter, and that carried over into his work at Mistwalker. Still crossing my fingers for that Fantasian port to, I don't know, any other devices other than an Apple device? The only time I can think of that Sakaguchi did sequels was with Blue Dragon, but every game in that series was a completely different game. The first was a turn-based RPG, then Blue Dragon Plus was a RTS, and Blue Dragon Awakened Shadow was more of an action RPG. So yeah, even when he makes sequels, they're not even really much of sequels. Actually, he did make a sequel to Terra Battle, but the second game flopped pretty hard, so it might be best to erase it from memory. He prefers the one and done deal. It's pretty well known that while Sakaguchi was involved with Final Fantasy VII and VIII, he was much more involved with Final Fantasy IX, even calling it his personal favorite.
I like 9, of course.
There are many reasons that Final Fantasy IX is great, but one of them is that it didn't try to shoot for the moon with its concept. It was intentionally crafted to not be so simple of a story that it could be told in just a couple of hours, but just complex enough to fit perfectly inside of a single 30 to 40 hour RPG, which is part of the reason I feel as though it stands the test of time better than 7 and 8 did. I feel that if they expanded the main storyline to be a 120-hour experience across 3 games, it would ruin the story, and specifically the pacing, which is something a particular modern game forgot about. I'm looking at you, Final Fantasy XVI. Most of the games that Sakaguchi has been involved in have this sort of energy to them that's kind of hard to explain. The games are just very well paced and plotted and rarely ever lose the player's interest. And Final Fantasy IX has arguably one of the best paced stories of any video game, let alone Final Fantasy. Sure, we could do an entire chapter discovering Dr. Todd's backstory and find out how he became a doctor, but odds are it would distract from the urgency of the plot. Now, don't get me wrong, if they can make a multi-part series of Final Fantasy IX and keep it engaging the entire way, I would love it. But I don't think it would work very well, and so you might think that I'm totally against the idea of expanding the story then. Well, that's also not entirely true. I'm sure that there are ways to expand it, and truthfully, I haven't played it in a while, so it would be hard for me to give any specific examples, which, by the way, I intend on replaying every Final Fantasy game in release order, and I mean every single player Final Fantasy game, including all the side games, so if you want to see my coverage of them as I go along, you'll probably want to subscribe. Anyways, they can expand the story a bit, but I have a hard time imagining that the main story would benefit from so much expansion that they would need to split the game into multiple parts. And notice that I say main story because I think one of the ways that they could expand the story is in the form of side quests. That's where we could discover many of the Tantalus members and other characters' backstories, but it wouldn't take away from the pacing of the main story too much. For all we know, it's possible that the developers may have even wanted to add side quests to cover some of the characters' backstories, but were unable to due to the limited storage capacity of CD-ROMs at the time. I mean, do you remember how you couldn't go back to like half the places in the game on disc 4 because there was mist? Now that was some bullshit. This wouldn't be a problem anymore, so they can theoretically add as many side quests at the end of the game as they want to. Now, I'm sure that there are some instances where adding extra parts to the main plotline would be warranted. If memory serves, there were some boring parts on disc 3, but it's been a while, so we'll see what I think when I replay the game. The point is that the extra content that would be worth adding to the main plot probably isn't enough to warrant a multi-part saga. It should all be part of a singular, complete game that is ideally maybe around 50 to 60 hours instead of 40. So we've talked about the visuals, we've talked about the story, but what about how the game plays? Like the battle system and exploration. Let's start with exploration. As you all know, the original game had pre-rendered backgrounds for towns and dungeons. Then they used a fully 3D overworld for traveling the distance between. It's quite obvious that they don't need to actually use pre-rendered backgrounds, but it's fairly easy to replicate the concept of it using a fully 3D world, but positioning the camera at a fixed angle so that the environments look like how they did in the original game. They did this in World of Final Fantasy to great effect, even adding things like depth of field to the camera view, which is a nice touch, and hope that if this is the direction they go in, that they add all the bells and whistles of modern graphical technology to their advantage. If they stay true to the exploration in that sense, then I would hope that they also stay true to the overworld coming back, and not just allowing us to select an option from the menu. For the love of God, please don't do one of these. If you do this, Square Enix, remaking this game will not be worth it. And anyone saying that overworlds look stupid with modern graphics clearly hasn't played the Ni no Kuni games. They look about as normal as they've always looked, which is to say that they have never looked normal considering your character is large enough to take a dump on any town in the game. So the question is, how do I think the camera should be positioned? Well, for the most part, I think that they should use a fixed camera perspective and stay true to the original game. I say for the most part because there is another alternative that would make sense to give the player free control over the camera. It's only worth doing that if they go open world or seamless world. I prefer to say seamless world because open world would imply that you can do things out of order, which I would prefer that they keep the story and world traversal more linear as it was in the original game, which this is what appears to be what Square Enix is doing with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which I'm extremely impressed that they are able to pull off. And who am I kidding? Having an entire one-to-one recreation of the world of Final Fantasy IX in the same way would just blow my mind. Of course I would want that. And if they did that, then of course the camera should be positioned behind the player character, and yes, you should be able to rotate it around as you please. However, part of the reason that they're able to pull this off with the Final Fantasy VII Remake is because they're turning it into multiple parts. Considering the fact that I said it should all be made into a single part, it's probably not reasonable to expect the game to have a fully seamless world, but one can dream. It would still be worth remaking if they used a fixed camera perspective for towns and dungeons and an old school overworld map, but it would really be worth remaking if it's a fully seamless world all packaged into a singular game. Now, before we start talking about the battle system, we need to talk about how you encounter battles first. Of course, the original game used a random encounter system, and to be fair, it's not the most egregious use of it. It's not as bad as many of the Super Nintendo Final Fantasy games where you'll often encounter a new battle after one step. I think most people can agree that random encounters in general are not the most user-friendly invention, but do I think that it should abandon random encounters entirely? Well, sorta. I think that it's possible to do random encounters without it feeling frustrating. The most obvious way is, of course, to just remove random encounters and replace them with on-screen enemies. And this is honestly a fine solution. If they did this for Final Fantasy IX Remake, I wouldn't complain. And naturally, this is not only what I would expect, but would be terrible if they did it any other way if they go the direction of making the world seamless. The other option is to do what games like Bravely Default did and what most of the Final Fantasy Remastered games have done, which is to have random encounters, but offer a setting to turn them off when you please. This isn't my favorite way of doing things, but it would get the job done. I've always felt that there are better ways of handling this kind of thing if you get creative enough, which is what I've done with the game I've been working on myself. And also appears to be what Fantasian has done as well, except I don't know much about it because Sakaguchi doesn't like porting games to hardware I actually own. It seems like you can store encounters and then unleash them when you want. Random encounters don't have to suck. You just have to be creative about how you implement them. If all they do is leave the random encounters exactly as they were in the original, then it won't be worth remaking. As long as they have some kind of improvement, even if it's just a setting to toggle them on or off, it will still be worth it, I suppose. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about how the Final Fantasy IX Remake should handle its battle system. To be honest, I don't think they should change much. I would prefer they stick to ATB turn-based combat. They could go the direction that Final Fantasy VII Remake series has gone, and I could accept that, but honestly, I think just keeping it the way it is would be the best way to remake the game. Many people are probably hoping they improve the speed of the ATB, and I do recall it being quite slow, but especially in the beginning before you have a full party anyways. There are times where you're just kind of sitting there with nothing happening while waiting for either you or the enemy's turn to come, but there are ways to fix that. For example, they can just program the game to automatically make the ATBs move at lightning speed when nobody's turn has come, and problem solved. The progression system is also fine. It's aged exceptionally well in much the same way as Final Fantasy VII, which is why Final Fantasy VII Remake largely kept the materia system the same. In fact, other games have copied Final Fantasy IX to this day, like learning skills and abilities from certain pieces of equipment. Naturally, it is an old game, so I'm sure that there are some UI improvements that can be made and other quality of life improvements, like maybe being able to fast forward animations and the like. And if they wanted to make the battles look more dynamic, they could have the characters move around a bit more like they do in Final Fantasy XIII instead of standing in a line. But if they're trying to hit the nostalgia, then they'll probably keep it old school. But truth be told, there's not really much I would say about the combat system, and some of this may be because I haven't played the game in quite some time, but like I said, I intend to play every Final Fantasy game, so when I get to this game, we'll see if my opinion changes or not. But for now, I think it should largely remain the same with just better graphics and animations, I suppose. So those are the things that I would want to see in a remake of Final Fantasy IX. Things that I think would actually make it worth remaking. I noticed that Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis added some new Final Fantasy IX content and costumes, and they still haven't shown us what this non-Final Fantasy VII announcement is yet, and the clock is ticking. So maybe Final Fantasy IX Remake will be at the Game Awards on December 7th? Will we find out then? We'll have to see. Anyways, do you guys agree or disagree with my takes? And if you could pick one thing that would make remaking Final Fantasy IX worth it, what would it be? Oh, and I did a little video ranking every Cid's theme from the Final Fantasy series. So if you like this video, you might want to click on that one, or tap it, or insert whatever verb you choose depending on the device you're using to watch this video. And as always, thanks for watching.